A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
A few weeks ago, I found myself in a situation that left me questioning my sanity and ultimately led me to this moment of confession. My cousin Jamie is 7, and he is, without a doubt, the most insufferable little monster I've ever encountered. From tantrums that could wake the dead to the way he crafts intricate lies just to see how far he can push the adults in his life, it's a miracle that he hasn't driven my poor aunt to the brink of madness. When my aunt asked me to babysit him for the weekend while she took on extra shifts at her job, a request that came with the guilt trip about how much she needed the money, I felt the flood of irritation rise within me. It wasn't just the idea of babysitting Jamie that made my skin crawl, it was the knowledge that he would spend the day trying to find creative ways to torture my patience. I remember the last time I babysat him, he told my aunt I had locked him in the bathroom for hours when I only stepped out to grab my phone from the kitchen, and she believed him without questioning a single word. Heart-pounding, the memory of his sweet, innocent smiling face as he recounted that fabricated tale to her on the phone replayed in my mind, and I snapped, Ida, for refusing. I had meant to gently decline, but my frustration erupted, and I told her I couldn't babysit a lying brat and that Jamie didn't deserve my help. The silence on the line spoke more than 100 words, and I could almost hear her heart shatter through the phone. I hung up, instantly filled with regret and the gnawing dread of what my refusal might mean for her job. Uncharacteristically, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, but I convinced myself that it was for my own sanity. That night, a gnawing sense of dread settled deep in my gut, as if I'd unknowingly invoked an ancient curse. It wasn't until the night of my refusal, just as I struggled to fall asleep, that I flicked off my lamp and was met with a whisper that slithered through the shadows of the room, the distinct sound of a child's laughter merging with the eerie creak of floorboards. My heart raced as I turned to face the darkened corner where the shadows projected odd shapes, and I dismissed it as a trick of my imagination. Yet, when I shut my eyes again, I could still hear it, his laughter, soft and sinister. Over the next few nights, the laughter grew louder and more distorted, as if taunting me for my past refusal, and I began experiencing vivid nightmares of Jamie lurking just outside my bedroom door, a twisted grin stitched across his face, his eyes glimmering with malice that should have never existed in a child. These weren't ordinary nightmares but vivid reenactments of every terrible thing he had done to me, the time he convinced me to jump into a freezing pool so he could watch me flail, or when he deliberately spilled soda all over my homework and feigned ignorance. He was attempting to break through in some dark, demonic way. I started doubting my reality. Was Jamie truly a lying brat, or was there a different, more sinister entity taking control of him? The whole week passed in a haze, each night marked by a new scream echoing in my mind, and each day drained me further. My aunt was clearly worried. She texted me not only to reassure me about Jamie but promised she wouldn't leave him with me ever again. Still, every time I thought of Jamie, I saw the flicker of something dreadful behind his eyes, almost a hunger for chaos that made my heart flutter with dread. And just as I began entertaining the idea of going to my aunt to apologize, a storm rolled in, pounding against my windows like a frantic child desperate for attention, forcing me to confront my refusal once and for all. 4 nights in, I was yanked from a thick slumber by the sound of footsteps in my living room and a familiar cackle that sent icy dread pooling in my stomach. Tired, shaky, and on edge, I crept down the hallway, my heart thumping hard enough to overlay the sounds of thunder. As I rounded the corner, clutching my phone like a fast-acting spell against whatever overlap between dream and reality awaited me, I came face to face with Jamie, grinning, his small figure silhouetted by moonlight spilling through my window. Except this time, there was something off about him, a deep shadow hanging over his form, almost tethering him to the floor as if gravity itself hungered to keep him from escaping my view. "Can I come in?" His voice was sweet, yet sinister, a perfect harmony of the innocent tone wrapped around the darkness that slipped through the walls like smoke. I blinked, unsure how to respond, frozen in the threshold of my own home. Was this truly my cousin, or had the shadows taken his form? "Let me in," he urged again, the sweetness giving way to a disturbing insistence, and as I stood there, every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. But I was paralyzed as we locked eyes, and if I hadn't summoned the will to yank the door shut, someone, would have slipped inside. After that encounter, I very nearly convinced myself I was losing my grip on reality, my mind betraying me, robbing me of the line between imagination and truth. But every scream of laughter echoing through the dark only bolstered my conviction that I had come face to face with something wicked. Days turned into a blur of anxiety as I huddled away from the world, each corner I turned feeling haunted by the shadow of laughter that taunted me from just beyond reach. When I heard a faint knock at the door days later, I felt my blood run cold, and for once, I thought of checking to see who would be foolish enough to knock after everything, but the creeping dread rooted me in place. Then, a faint giggle burst through, and I knew it was Jamie. Memories of my aunt pleading with me to forgive him flashed, but deep down, I understood my refusal echoed through to this day, and I prayed the darkness would answer since I didn't dare look up at the door. Instead of opening up, I chose to remain haunted by the shadow of that constant laughter, and in a twisted reality I had only begun to comprehend. I waited, driven out of necessity to understand that some monsters are very real and don't exist merely in stories. I chose to ignore that knock, hoping to bury my guilt in silence, but what would I do now when, no matter where I turned, the sound of Jamie's laughter remained a reminder of the child I once knew who now belonged to the dark? I never thought refusing to give candy to my neighbor's kids could spiral into something so terrifying, but that's how the nightmare began. It started innocently enough. It was Halloween, and like every year, I had stocked up on the usual assortment of sweets, but this time, I was adamant about not giving any to the children who lived next door. You see, that family had moved in just a few months prior, and their kids, 2 boys named Jake and Sam, were anything but normal. Sure, at first glance, they seemed like regular kids, dressed up as superheroes and goblins just like everyone else, but there was always something off about their laughter. It echoed too loudly, cutting through the comforting air of the evening like a serrated knife, and their smiles stretched a little too wide, revealing too much of their teeth. When they came to my door that evening, I felt the dread knotting in my stomach as I looked down at their expectant faces, makeup smeared and gleaming like freshly spilled blood under the streetlight. I simply shook my head, muttered a polite sorry, and closed the door quickly, heart racing because as soon as I did, they stepped back and their expressions morphed from disappointment to something almost predatory. I pressed my ear against the door, expecting them to turn away, but instead, I could hear whispers, words I couldn't quite make out, conversations swaying and twisting in the air until it felt like even the walls were sharpening their ears, and then, with a slight click, I saw the doorknob turn, my heart dropping into my stomach. I rushed to check the locks, my breath hitching, and when I glanced back at the door, their faces were close against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, pupils dilated like black holes ready to swallow me whole. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. Later that night, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, hoping to drown out the relentlessness of their sadistic giggles echoing through the dark. At midnight, I heard a sudden thud against the side of the house, my heart leapt, panic clawing at my throat, and I peeked out from the window. They stood there, cloaked in shadows, still wearing their costumes, but something else flickered in their eyes, a mischief so sinister it sent tremors sparking through my veins. I decided to call the police, dialing with shaking fingers, and as I whispered my fears into the phone, the operator's voice faded into a distant stream of incoherence while I watched through the blinds as the children began to move away, stage whispering to each other, as if plotting something insidious, their brazen confidence fueling a dark weight of inevitability in my stomach. I hung up the phone, listening for sirens that never came while I recalled every warning my mother had given me about children who looked too perfect, acting too strange, those warnings blurring with the image of their wide, gleaming smiles piercing through the night air. As the hours edged closer to dawn, the atmosphere thickened, like fog curling around my ankles, whispers suddenly morphing into faint, high-pitched giggles that echoed through the silence of my home. I thought of calling out, confronting them, telling them to go home, to leave me alone, but the tightly wound ball of fear kept me glued to my spot. Instead, I wandered through my house, turning on every light like a moth drawn to reassurance, the manic laughter substituting for the innocence of children's games. It wasn't until I heard a light knock at my back door that I felt the color drain from my face. I stayed silent, hoping it was a trick of the wind, but then again came the knock, this time sharp and insistent. I decided I couldn't ignore them any longer. My curiosity had grown too vast, pulling me forward toward the back door. I cracked it open just a fraction, and I saw them, the 2 boys standing there, their costumes barely illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. But they weren't just looking for candy anymore. Their faces were now almost nurturing, almost saccharine, and they spoke in murmurs that had no relation to the holiday anymore. "Aren't you lonely?" they asked, and the words slithered into my mind like venom, splitting open the dark corners that had learned to fear the silence. For a moment, I thought about inviting them in just to make the madness stop, to tame the swirling chaos they stirred within me, but I held my ground, glaring at their childish facade, desperate for any semblance of caution that might assert that I wasn't losing my mind so soon. "We don't bite," Sam said with a grin that seemed too sharp, two tiny daggers glimmering in the faint light. I slammed the door shut and without thinking, turned the lock, breath trembling as I stumbled back into my hallway, desperate to gather my thoughts. The night dragged on in a vicious cycle of laughter, knocks, and whispers, each sound doubling down on the anxiety pounding in my chest when suddenly, I heard it, my phone vibrating on the table. I could have sworn it was the police, patrolling the area after my call. As I looked at the screen, my heart dropped. It was a text from my neighbor, the boy's mother. It read, "There's something wrong with my boys. Don't let them in. We'll take care of it." My mind blanked in that moment, and then came the realization that I had no idea what was in those boys, and the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize, it wasn't just them. It was something divine and grotesque, a darkness like tar creeping between the walls of this quiet house, and when the electricity flickered, illuminating their faces for a split second, hands pressed against the glass, breath fogging up the pain, I knew I was stuck, lost in the entropy of my choices. Their forms pulsed in the light, eventually blending back into darkness as if they were merely shadows stitched from the fabric of fear, and then came a crashing sound, something like wood splintering against a brick wall. My breath stilled, my heart thudding against my ribcage, and I ran to the window in time to see a figure darting from my yard, but I couldn't see who it was. Was it the boys or someone else, something else? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The night blurred past, a cacophony of terror against my ears, the boys receding back into their home, laughter fading until I could hear the heavy insistence of my own heartbeat and my breath. And before the dawn swept in, I made a decision, I would confront them. But when morning arrived, the shadows dispersed, and a calm fell across the neighborhood. The boys were gone, their family vanished without a trace. I knocked on the door of the house next door, rapping my knuckles against the splintering wood, and when it swung open, a stranger stared back at me, a woman with sunken eyes and the coldness of a grave wrapped around her silence. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, and I felt the winds shift around me. When I described the family, expecting a semblance of recognition, her gaze darkened. "I've lived here for years," she said slowly. "No children have ever lived next door." And just like that, the reality of the boys haunted me like a ghost, those monstrous smiles slicing through my sanity, echoing a question that repeated with no answer, "Ida for not giving the neighbor's kids candy?" The words now strung like a noose around my mind, tightening it into terror. And as I stumbled back into my own home, the lights flickering ominously above me, I realized that perhaps in refusing to give candy, I had given them something much worse, my fear, the key to a darkness that would never leave me. The moment I stepped into my classroom that dreary Thursday morning, I could feel a heaviness in the air, a tension coiling like a serpent about to strike, and as the morning sun struggled to filter through the grimy windows, my heart sank when I noticed a sea of students excitedly whispering in the corners, their eyes darting towards Sophia, a bright-eyed, hopeful 15-year-old with an infectious smile that often lit up the room. She had been dreaming of her quinceañera for years, a celebration of her transition into womanhood, and as her teacher, I could see the crescendo of her hopes building with each passing day, especially as she summoned the courage to approach me after class, a breathless determination etched across her face as she asked if I would help her plan it. My instincts screamed at me that something was amiss. Rumors whispered through the halls, hints of troubles at home that not even I, the well-meaning teacher, could unravel fully, but I nodded, a slight encouragement at the corners of my mouth. I agreed to help with the decorations and even promised I'd talk to the administration about allowing her to use the school gym for the event. Yet, as the days turned into weeks and the excitement around her quince spiraled into something resembling fairy tale hype among the students, I couldn't shake the growing unease that shadowed my heart, fueled by encounters I had with her family's financial struggles. When Sophia, glowing and radiant, approached me the following week to finalize some of the plans, I hesitated, the weight of uncertainty clutching at my throat, and when I muttered that I wasn't sure if she could have the quince due to potential issues stemming from her family background, the air thickened, her smile faltered, the color drained from her cheeks like someone had pulled the plug on her dream. A stunned silence fell over the classroom, the other students leaning in, wide-eyed, and I tried to clarify myself, to retract my words, but the damage was done. She turned on her heel and fled, leaving behind an echo of disbelief. From that moment on, I felt a shift. The whispers grew louder, not just amongst the students, but I could feel the chastising stares of the faculty, their judgment as corrosive as acid, speculating if I crushed a girl's aspirations with a careless comment. Days slipped by in a haze of regret, Sophia avoiding my gaze, her laughter replaced with a sorrowful hush, and just when I thought I might make amends, I was hit with an email from the school's principal informing me that Sophia's family had withdrawn her from school, effective immediately. Panic clawed at my chest. I wanted to reach out, to apologize, to let her know I never meant to upset her, but the digital void was deafening, a complete stop to all communication, and I was left to wonder if my offhanded comment had spiraled into something far darker than I could comprehend, until one night, after tossing and turning under blankets of regret, I received a chilling email from Sophia herself. The subject line read simply, "You were right," and as I opened it, I felt ice peel back the layers of my guilt. The email revealed that her home life had grown increasingly chaotic, her family struggling with unseen demons, her father losing his job, the celebratory dresses replaced with hunger pangs, and buried within the paragraphs was something that made my heart lurch. She wrote of a plan to reclaim her narrative, to find hope amidst the shadows that threatened to consume her entire existence, and as I read her words, the line blurred between despair and resolve, making me question my own role, my own cruel insensitivity, for I realized too late that my uncertainty had not only cast a cloud over her quinceañera but had transformed into something far more sinister. It had unwittingly exposed a fracture that ran deeper, something I never grasped until it was too late. The email concluded with just a single question: is there really a chance for me? The sorrow woven through her words struck me, coursed through my veins like a wildfire, igniting a desperation to reach out and guide her, but when I tried, my emails bounced back. Her family had severed all ties, pulling her from the world that had become too oppressive, too unforgiving, and it struck me like an axe splintering wood. My hope for her future had become twisted with every moment I'd let my doubts fester and grow, leaving me with a shrouded understanding in the silence that followed her departure. The echoes of laughter that once filled my classroom were replaced by an eerie stillness, and as I sat, the burden of guilt settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat, I couldn't help but wonder if I had not only become a stranger in her life but a ghost in my own, a cautionary tale of how a thoughtless remark, even in the name of caution, could chip away at the dreams of someone so young, trapped in the shadows of their own despair. All because I had been too afraid to believe in the chances that flickered like a distant candle, extinguished by my own doubts. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum as I stood at the edge of our yard, peering through the trees at the gathering across the street where my younger sister and her friends threw what they called a party. It wasn't the kind of party filled with balloons and cake. It was dark and chaotic, the flickering glow of a cheap disco light battling against the encroaching shadows of twilight. I had always been the responsible one, the one who stayed inside and studied while my sister, Mia, had been allowed to explore the edges of that reckless freedom. But as I listened to their laughter thick with smoke and heard the muffled beats of music that felt too loud for our suburban neighborhood, a knot of dread twisted in my stomach. When I accidentally overheard snippets of their conversations just a few nights before, a part of me wanted to look away, pretend I didn't hear them boast about sneaking out, drinking, and trying drugs, things I never thought Mia would dare to touch. But every time I thought about ignoring it, I pictured the way our mother would break if something happened to Mia, and the moral weight that pressed down on me was suffocating. I had to make a choice. So, I did what I thought was right, and I slipped through the door, my palms clammy against the cold brass knob, and I told our mother everything. At first, she didn't believe me. Perhaps she couldn't bear to think that our sweet Mia, her golden child, could stoop to such depths. I led her to the window, hoping this time she would listen, and with each step toward that gathering, I felt the ground beneath me shift, the air growing heavy with anticipation for both of us. The moment she turned pale and I saw her fists clench, I knew I'd made the right choice. But the reality we stepped into was nothing short of catastrophic. Mia's laughter vanished into the night as Mom stormed over to where they were dancing, and I wished I could feel as invincible as they seemed. When Mom confronted her friends, I watched the chaos unfold, their innocence bled away, replaced by guilt, as they scattered like skittles dropped on asphalt. Mia, shattered and furious, faced our mother the way a wild animal afraid for its life might confront a hunter. What followed was a symphony of screaming that rattled the very windows, a confrontation that carved itself into the fabric of our family. My sister was kicked out of the house that night, a decision permeated with shame playing across my mother's face like a veil. The last time I saw Mia, she stood at the door, eyes locked onto mine, and I dared not look away. Could I, the one who had always protected her, really be the monster who caused all this? Was I, in fact, an awful person for looking out for her? Guilt ate at me for days following the incident, but there was also a creeping sense of fear lingering in the corners of my mind. As the days melted into weeks, Mia's absence turned our home into a hollow shell. Our mother's grief manifested in silence, each meal a reminder of the laughter that once filled the air. I received mixed messages from everyone. Friends at school whispered their pity while my teachers offered me haunting looks that spoke volumes, as if they miraculously knew my hand in the fray. I thought about reaching out to Mia, but the shame rooted me in place, tightening every nerve and leaving me wondering if I had made a dreadful mistake. One night, when I couldn't bear the haunting guilt any longer, I decided to text Mia, an olive branch, a feeble apology hidden behind layers of regret. But instead of the expected "I miss you" or "I understand," she simply replied, "You have no idea what you've done." Those words slashed through my chest. I half expected a sob fest but instead got cold dread that coiled within me. For weeks, I left my phone on my bed, too frightened to reach out again, until one day when I received an unexpected voicemail. "You'll pay for this," she snarled, her voice dripping with malice, warped and unrecognizable. From that moment on, the atmosphere shifted. I felt eyes on me, shadows lurking just behind my shoulders. I could hear the whisper of Mia's name on the wind whenever I walked to school, could sense the malicious energy in the air that followed me home. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, heart racing, convinced Mia had turned into something more sinister, a specter lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for the right moment to pounce. Then, the knocks started, quiet at first but building into furious strikes that made me jump. Each time I opened the door, my heart would leap, praying it was merely a neighbor or the pizza delivery guy, but always hoping to see her face, until one evening, it was my mother who answered the door, forcing a grin, sagging under the weight of her grief. That night, the silence deepened, a heavy blanket pressing over our home, and I could swear I heard Mia's laughter echoing off the walls in the dead of night. The weeks dragged on, my anxiety spiraled, until I could no longer tell when I was awake or dreaming. Then came the night of terror, an unspeakable thing that broke through the stillness of our home. It awakened me from a restless sleep, a piercing shriek echoing like steel scraping against stone. I bolted up, breath hitched in my throat, heart pounding as I grabbed my phone, praying it wasn't Mia, that she hadn't returned to exact her revenge. I opened the door a crack, shadows danced under the moonlight, and creeping dread slid into my bones. As I stepped into the hallway, the familiar scent of smoke clawed at my throat, reminding me of those forgotten nights by the tree across the street. What I found at the end was nothing I could have ever imagined. Mia stood there, features twisted in rage, surrounded by her friends, an odd gathering that felt both foreign and familiar in a way I couldn't comprehend. Except now, they wore masks, faces twisted in grotesque expressions, and when they turned to me, the air filled with chilling laughter that echoed my wildest fears, inhuman, mocking. "You should have left us alone," Mia hissed, her voice slipping through the masks of her friends, haunting and venomous. I tried to back away, but a force pulled me forward, chaotic energy bubbling in the air, vibrating through my bones, my heart racing in fear. "What do you want?" I stammered, but the swirling laughter grew louder, drowning out my voice and whispering, "It's your fault, you wanted this." In that moment, I realized the truth planted firmly in the pit of my stomach. I didn't just lose my sister that night, I had lost myself as well. The love I thought could conquer all had twisted into something malevolent, and I was left in a game I never volunteered to play. As the laughter soared, crescendoing into a feral din that shattered the walls of my sanity, frantic thoughts raced through my mind. Were they all just figments of my imagination? But the unmistakable truth clamped around my throat like a vice. I had brought this darkness upon both our lives. I could hear them chanting, words that stole the warmth from my soul, and at that moment, I understood their true nature. They were no longer just me as friends, they were something darker, something that thrived in the shadows I had feared all along. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of regret and despair suffocating, and there, in the dim light of the hallway, I realized not just who Mia had become, but also who I had become, a puppet on strings of guilt. As the laughter enveloped me, each teasing taunt whispered back memories of warmth, love, and laughter, replaced now by darkness, echoing indefinitely against the walls of our broken home. In that moment of clarity, I knew it was too late to save her, and too late to save myself. Every Thanksgiving, I felt obligated to attend my aunt's annual dinner, a tradition that started before I was even born, but this year felt different, almost oppressive. It was a routine gathering embellished with family feuds and stories of past mischief, but a thick air of something ominous clung to the dining room. As we sat down, the scent of roasted turkey mingled with something disconcertingly sour, a smell I could not quite place. My eyes landed on the side dish Aunt Helen had brought, a massive casserole of what she called Thanksgiving surprise. Something about its texture, the way it glistened under the dining room lights, made my stomach churn. It looked almost like it had been reheated, the edges crisped just enough to hint it might have spent more than a few days in her fridge, or maybe worse, her basement. It wouldn't be the first time I had suspicions about Aunt Helen's cooking. Last year, I remembered swallowing dry turkey while she told me about her magic spice she sprinkled in everything, but nothing that magical came to mind when I examined her last-minute concoction. She caught me looking, her eyes narrowing, and suddenly a wave of guilt washed over me. "You're not going to try my special dish?" she asked. The way she said it felt almost like a challenge, and I felt trapped in the moment, everyone staring expectantly, utensils poised, ready to dive into their plates like eager wolves. I hesitated, a million thoughts colliding in my mind, the family outcast for not trying Aunt Helen's cooking versus potential illness. Instead of answering, I politely said, "I'm full." My lie hung in the air like the sweet potato casserole quietly baking in the oven, and for a moment, you could feel a collective shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of bonds that were already fraying, an unseen weight pressing down on us all. Aunt Helen laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, it echoed strangely in the room, tinged with something unsettling. "Oh, sweetie, there's always room for family," she insisted as she scooped a heaping spoonful onto my plate anyway. I could feel my face flush, the need to say no battled by the pressure of familial obligation. My heart raced as I pushed the plate away, a plea to my mom for help dancing in my eyes. She merely shrugged, seemingly lost in her own food coma, and Aunt Helen's vibe shifted to something predatory. I was suddenly acutely aware that I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her cooking, the dish itself looking far too stale, too out of place, and an echo of horror rose up within me. She had a reputation for experimenting, especially with her more unconventional recipes. Trusting my instincts, I politely declined once more, repeating my mantra about being full, yet Aunt Helen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "You know you can't not eat it. It's special, like our family." A chill ran down my spine, a clear implication that unwillingness wasn't merely an option. My plate, sitting there, so innocently menacing, suddenly became a focal point of dread, and I could feel the eyes of my relatives on me, their longing to see tradition upheld clashing with my rising panic. The moment stretched on indefinitely, and Helen's expression morphing from a faux sweet smile to something that sent a tremor through my spirit, a frown laced with unyielding expectation and a hint of malice. Somewhere deep inside, I felt her frustration swirling like a storm, and I suddenly remembered stories, whispers, that Aunt Helen had experimented with unusual ingredients before, substances that could only be described as unique, maybe even dangerous. In a moment of clarity, I could imagine the casserole magically becoming the centerpiece of her questionable culinary adventures. Perhaps she had unearthed a recipe passed down through the generations, one made with something far too bizarre to be served at a standard family gathering. My stomach turned again as the fear bubbled over. I couldn't shake the image of her examining her creation in her dimly lit kitchen, the sounds of her cackling laughter dancing with the phantom memories of the dishes I had once consumed, turning sour and abandoned long before Thanksgiving. The tension broke only when my cousin Joey made a joke that landed flat, but the deflection only caused Aunt Helen to fissure. The silence grew loud and thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions until she snapped, "You'll eat it. It's not Thanksgiving without my special dish." With each insistence, I could feel the pull of tradition choking me like a stranglehold, gnawing at my resolve, pipes of familial loyalty clinging to me as if refusing to let go. I felt the eyes of relatives proclaiming judgment, silently questioning if I would survive another year without indulging Aunt Helen's craving for pressuring me to devour it. One bite, I convinced myself, just one. Finally, I mustered some courage, my hand trembling as it reached for the serving spoon, and then I froze, caught mid-movement, my imagination racing ahead, scripting the silent horror play of what could happen if I surrendered, for what if the dish was made of despair? What if I, too, fell prey to the ancient recipe, consumed by whatever vile secrets lay within? "Aunt Helen, I just can't," I finally stammered, glimpsing the anger surging in her eyes before I reluctantly blurted out the truths I had bottled up. "I can't eat things that have been sitting around." "What if it's bad?" The room went deathly quiet, tension crackling like electric current. Aunt Helen's face morphed from frustration to an eerie calm, a chilling smile stretching across her features. "Oh, sweetie," she cooed, and I think I detected a touch of satisfaction beneath that sugar-coated voice. "You have no idea what's good for you, do you? This recipe is an heirloom passed down through generations, a commitment of love and sacrifice." In my gut, dread swirled with pure terror as the world fell away, Aunt Helen morphing into an almost fiendish apparition desperate for me to partake in her eerie legacy. The air surrounded me felt apparent with sinister undertone, and every muscle in my body screamed to get away from that table as I heard the whispers of cousins muttering behind me, "Are you really going to challenge her? Family comes first." Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the lights flickered, and a horrible realization washed over me. They all seemed to be bound to this sick ritual, a cycle fueled by hidden secrets and untold sacrifices. Then Aunt Helen continued, her voice low and almost seductive, "You think we're all just here for the food, don't you? But it's the dish that binds us, keeps our family together through everything, including those who, let's say, didn't make it to the end of the feast last year." A cold shiver crawled up my spine, and a sickening clarity washed over me, a dark understanding fretting at my sanity as I envisioned an empty chair at the table, last year's dinner where a cousin had simply vanished. Was it possible that something more sinister was cooking beneath that surface? The thought propelled me to my feet, my stomach rebelling against me in scathing protest. "I can't," I screeched, the words pouring out of me like molten lava. "I refuse." I bolted for the door as Aunt Helen's chilling laughter echoed behind me, a sound I was convinced would haunt me forever. I rushed outside, my breath leaving me in sharp gasps and my mind racing, picturing the plate of Thanksgiving surprise, the voiceless screams it held, the lingering stench of something rotten that tainted not just the casserole but maybe everything about our family. I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't turn back, couldn't be ensnared in whatever dark web Aunt Helen had woven, and I'd sooner fast until Christmas than find out just how far she would go to preserve her twisted legacy. I stumbled into the night, knowing I would be the family outcast in their eyes, but anything was better than feasting on the horrors of last year. As the darkness closed in around me, a thrill of freedom coursed through my veins, and yet, a lingering question remained, would I be the one uninvited next year, or would the casserole have its appetite satisfied before another Thanksgiving crept upon us? When my wife and I first decided to have a child, we envisioned a picture-perfect family life, complete with spontaneous road trips and Sunday barbecues, but reality is often sharper than expectations, and soon daily life morphed into a relentless grind dominated by one irritating truth. Our 3-year-old daughter, Emily, was a nighttime terror, waking up screaming from apparitions that seemed to haunt her dreams, and after several weeks of sleepless nights, I found myself wrestling with an increasingly impossible choice. So, when my wife, Jessica, suggested right after dinner one Tuesday that we start taking Emily to daycare, I felt like I was being edged toward the cliff of parental sanity. "She's sleepy," I thought. "She won't sleep at daycare, she'll scream for me." I braced myself for weeks of bargaining with a toddler over nap time, so when it was suggested that I take Emily to daycare, a mere 20-minute drive in the same direction Jessica takes each morning, I hesitated. The logic seemed to infuriate me. How would it save us time, really, when I could just keep her at home where we had a semblance of control over our lives? I could hear her tiny voice, coffee-stained with the innocence of childhood, "Daddy, please don't make me go." And it twisted my insides. I became emotionally overdrawn, my derailed thoughts split between tender affection for my little girl and the desperation of exhausted parents craving normalcy. In the end, feelings won, and after more sleepless nights than I could count, I blurted out, "Ida, for not taking Emily to daycare when it's just a 20-minute drive in the same direction as you, Jess?" What followed was the kind of argument that left both our hearts pounding and eyes stinging with tears. She couldn't understand how I could deny our daughter some structure, something stable to ground her restless spirit. My reluctance, according to Jessica, was merely a selfish desire to pacify my own guilt. But every irritation piled like flammable kindling, till last week it burst into flames. Emily woke up again, shrieking about monsters, her eyes wild as if they were windows to a thrilling, chaotic nightmare, and I felt the heat rise in my chest while my wife hissed at me to make that drive to the daycare. I refused, heart racing, sweat forming on my brow, burying my head beneath the pillow, convinced if nothing else, at least she was safe with me. All the what-ifs clawed at me. What if I was a terrible father, a godforsaken monster who could not endure the screams of a scared child? I was alone in this decision, swimming in a tidal wave of guilt as each morning unveiled a fresh list of rear-end kisses. The shame burned bright, especially when Jessica resorted to the ultimate parent's leverage, silent treatment, and the bitterness festered, hardened into resentments neither of us embraced but neither could deny. Then came the night it happened. Emily woke me up, summoning me with trembling babbles. An unexplainable chill lanced through me, almost sent me shivering out of bed. I went to her room and found her staring blankly at the walls. They seemed to breathe, swell, distort, whispering secrets in a language I didn't understand. "What's wrong, Emily?" I whispered, soothingly, but all I could manage was a stammer. She pointed to the window, lips quivering, and said, "Daddy, I don't like the closet anymore." The closet sat in darkness, ominous like a black mouth waiting to devour, and despite my instincts, I sat down next to her. After a few heart-wrenching moments, I dared to creep slowly towards the closet, swinging it open, only to find nothing, just clothes draping silently, shrouded like ghosts. I was about to close it when I noticed something unnatural, a reflection. For half a heartbeat, I thought I saw something flicker beyond the veil of silence, reaching for Emily's face, but then it vanished. I snapped it shut, and Emily cried. I wanted to gather her in my arms, to tell her it was going to be okay, but my voice cracked, fear clambering up my throat as I turned, surveying the room, convinced I had entered the realm of nightmares myself. For days, life twisted further out of alignment. The screams in the night returned, but now they spoke in strangled whispers, cryptic syllables turning my sweet girl into a captive of her own anguish. My resolve began to splinter when I suddenly understood that denying her aid would forever seal us in an embrace of despair, so in a fit of hopeless desperation that fateful Saturday morning, I relented, grabbed Emily, bundled her into the car, and we made that dreaded 20-minute drive to daycare, a measure of desperate hope dancing against the back of my mind. Yet, with my heart pounding, I saw that familiar chalkboard sign out front, announcing "We love our little ones." But beneath it was a smear of deep red. Instincts blared alarms, and the moment we stepped inside, the air turned tainted, tinged with despair that felt like an iron fist squeezing my lungs. The children were there, faces blank as if they were marionettes in a play where no one knew the lines. I turned to my sweet girl, gripping my palm around her little hand, and together we approached the woman at the front desk, a nurse with eyes too soft, a smile too wide. "Time to play, sweet pea," she chimed, but I saw through it. I wasn't ready to leave Emily there, and though she kicked and cried, begging, "Don't go, Daddy," the nurse gripped her too tightly, coaxing her with promises of fun. As I stumbled back to my car, a weight settled around my shoulders. What if I was never coming back? My trembling hands held the wheel like a lifeline, feeling the screams from the back of my mind pressing down, reverberating against each gut reaction, like echoes ringing through dimly lit corridors. For hours, I wrestled between sanity and dread, each ticking second morphing into hourglass grains of despair. Each minute felt unendurable, anxiety coiling tighter until my fear ignited like fire, and the need to go back became irrational, overwhelming. I darted back to daycare in a terrifying frenzy, my heart racing in erratic tempo, but the moment I returned, everything changed. Emily was nowhere in the chaotic, sterile playroom, and the nurse was gone without a trace. In a panic, I scoured every corner, digging through the laughter that taunted my railed senses, dread seeping thick and curling around me as I pushed through the door to the playground, only to witness Emily sitting on the ground alone, her bright blue eyes fixed on the sky, whispering almost urgently to something, or someone. "Emily!" I screamed, fear devolving into a chilling hollowness rapidly spreading through my body. It wrapped itself around my throat like a rope. Her eyes were wide, too wide, staring into the abyss, and no one in that bleak daycare seemed to care. They all continued on, as if puppets on a string, tied to an inaudible rhythm while Emily's soft voice spoke urgently to the shadowed form at the edge of the playground. My heart slammed in its cage as dread crumpled around me. I rushed towards her, snatched her up against me, and that's when the figures leapt from the shadows, the pure innocence of her childhood spilling into oblivion as if to taunt me with the impending doom. I shouted her name once more, and suddenly, I felt the world tilt, the realm twisting with each breath as black threads surged through the space. In that moment, I understood. Ida for not taking Emily to daycare? No, it was far more sinister than that, for not heeding the warnings whispered through her dreams and mine. For years, I prided myself on my ability to endure my friend Clara's so-called quirky behavior, the kind that often left me cringing, but I insisted to myself that everyone has their oddities and I should be accepting, even if her antics made me uncomfortable. It was Clara's signature thing to speak her thoughts aloud about everyone around us. It often felt more like a brutal commentary rather than quirky charm. Just last week at the cafe, she loudly mused about how the barista's skin seemed to glow in that weird artificial light and how she wouldn't trade her unique red-streaked hair for anything in the world, while the barista flinched from embarrassment. I silently cursed the day Clara just decided it was okay to play social commentator without any filter, but I almost let it slide until her antics escalated at a party for another friend's birthday. As the night went on, her quirkiness spiraled into something I could no longer ignore when she leaned over to a group of us and declared that she, frankly, believed that most people's opinions were below her own, and even professed how she thought the birthday girl's dress made her look like a scuffed-up potato, as everyone squirmed in disbelief while Clara cackled at her own boldness, clearly oblivious to the growing discomfort around us. It was then that I snapped. Maybe it was the booze or the mounting unease, but I felt the pressure in my chest and the fire rising in my throat before I realized I had shouted out, "Ida, for telling you that your quirky behavior is just plain rude?" Silence fell over the room like an anvil crashing into a pool of water, and by the stunned expressions on our friends' faces, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of dread because I didn't know what would happen next. Clara's eyes turned to slits, and I could see a bewildered rage starting to bubble just beneath the surface as she processed what I had hurled at her. A tense moment passed before she laughed, but it was a sharp, humorless sound, cutting through the thick air like a knife. She straightened up, and the moment that followed was a cutthroat silence where every single one of our friends veered their eyes between us, unwilling to pick sides, but I could almost feel the ground shifting, the subtle change in energy that warned me I had awakened something far worse than awkwardness. Her voice dripped with venom as she launched into a tirade about how tired she was of people pretending to be happy and how incapable they were of being real, claiming that I was the one who needed to wake up and actually embrace the authenticity she so proudly represented. She painted me as the villain in my own story, shoving my character into a corner while she proclaimed herself as the fearless truth-teller, and everything spiraled from there. The rest of the party echoed her sentiments, turning their backs on me, and suddenly I found myself standing alone in the living room, humiliated while Clara reveled in her newfound role as the underdog champion of anti-niceties, and for a second, I found myself weighing every moment I had put up with her over the years. As I retreated to the bathroom, my heart thrumming wildly in my chest, I wiped my clammy hands on my jeans and stared at my reflection, feeling both relieved and tormented by my own impulsive outburst. Was I wrong? Regrettably, I couldn't shake this overwhelming cloud of guilt, knowing I might have misplaced my aggression towards her flippancy. The atmosphere outside was thick and moldy, mirroring the darkness brewing in my chest, but when I emerged to rejoin the throng of partygoers, something shifted in the air that arguably felt more sinister. Clara was still entertaining our friends, but something in her demeanor had soured. The edges of her smiles were sharp, and the way she was speaking had morphed into something unsettling, her eyes glinting with an unsettling mirth, and as if she drew strength from my moment of weakness, the comments she tossed flared deeper, aiming at our friends with precision, laced with an underlying current of malice that felt palpable. I tried to shake off the odd sensation creeping up behind me, a whispered warning flooding my gut, but as I left the party, I caught sight of Clara through the window, her gaze burning into my back as if she were carving my silhouette into the darkening night. Days passed, and each attempt to explain my perspective was met with confusion and rebuttal from mutual friends. They didn't see her for what she was. Desperate, I pulled one of the friends aside and asked if they noticed how my words had sparked a shift in Clara's behavior. His face paled, and he confessed that he'd seen Clara trying to turn seemingly innocent jokes into cruel barbs aimed at anyone who questioned her, that none of us were truly safe anymore. It felt like I had torn open a wound, exposing something dark and festering beneath the surface, and I wished I could just go back, apologize, and rewind time to prevent my slip from turning Clara's soiree into a breeding ground for her sadistic quips masquerading as humor. At that moment, Clara confronted me one last time before our mutual friends, and with chilling clarity, she stared down the crowded bar with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked me if I'd like to play a little game, and when I refused, she merely laughed, menacing and melodious, as she proclaimed how friendships are merely social contracts that can easily be broken. Suddenly the laughter around us fell like dead leaves, air thick with an unspoken terror that formed a pact in the back of my mind. I started getting messages, odd and cryptic from unknown numbers in the days that followed, with pictures of me snapped through blurry camera lenses. The first couple felt harmless, eerie at worst, that stirred up good old paranoia unlike anything I had felt previously, but when one simply read, "We are all friends until the mind cracks," then what? I realized that this wasn't merely Clara being annoyed, it was personal, a form of psychological warfare. It culminated that Friday night when I walked alone from my car, feeling the audience of unseen eyes on the back of my neck, creeping up my spine until I reached my front door, yet I still felt the safety of my home was nothing more than an illusion when I heard Clara's familiar laugh from somewhere in the shadows. Alone in my room amidst the anxious shrill of my heart, I resolved to cut ties, rid myself of Clara and all that she encompassed. But just as the decision crumbled to form in my mind, another message pinged on my phone, this time an audio recording where I could hear Clara's voice gently whispering my name over and over again, and instead of a sense of relief, all I felt was dread. She knew where I lived. My heart raced, thoughts spiraled out of control as panic squeezed my chest tighter and the oppressive thunk of my pulse hammered in my ears. I had awakened something in her, transformed her into something dark and unrecognizable, and I realized, in that very moment, as I sat paralyzed and alone, a chilling truth sunk in. I had ignited a storm, and there was no turning back. The laughter would only grow louder. So tell me, was I wrong for attempting to call her out? Or did I unknowingly summon the very monster I attempted to escape? As the lights flickered overhead, a shadow danced along the wall, and I realized in horror that sometimes, the line between quirky and cruel is drawn in blood, and I was right in the center, and it wasn't over yet. I always thought high school drama was exaggerated in movies, but nothing could have prepared me for what unfurled one fateful Friday afternoon as I shoved my books into my backpack with trembling hands, my mind racing with anxiety over the upcoming prom. I had a casual friendship with Ethan, a guy who was smart and funny but had prolonged his geeky phase through all 4 years of school, and though he had a crush on me, I could never consider him as a prom partner, not with there being a big social hierarchy that I was desperately trying to navigate. It was already bad enough that Jenna and her clinging normie crew were constantly whispering about me, labeling me the loner who dared to choose her own path outside of their cliques. It was just supposed to be a night of fun and dancing, but I couldn't shake off the pressure of finding the perfect date to prove I belonged. As if the universe were mocking me, my phone buzzed with notifications, each one signaling a growing storm, Jenna's endless posts on social media revealing her preparation for the big night, and my heart sank as I saw her prime date, a popular guy, laugh and bewitch everyone with his charm. That morning, I had finally made it clear to Ethan that he wasn't my type. I had taken care to soften the blow but left him crushed nonetheless. Then came the worst part. His mother decided to confront me. She found me waiting at the school gates, her eyes sharp and probing, like those of a hawk who has spotted something amiss. "My son told me you've decided not to take him to prom," she said, her voice laced with aggression. I offered her a polite smile, trying to diffuse the rising tension, but she bulldozed right through it. "You need to look at your own choices," she insisted, drawing nearer, the scent of her cheap perfume wrapping tightly around me, like a noose. I could feel myself becoming dizzy, trapped in a suffocating spiral of anger and fear. The nerve of her, accusing me of ruining her son's prom when they hadn't even asked themselves the question that mattered: why would I choose someone who spent most of his time obsessing over comics and video games? "Listen," I managed to say, my voice steadier than my shaking hands, "I'd for telling you to look at your son before blaming me. He's sweet, but he deserves someone who cherishes him, not just someone looking for a pity date." Time felt suspended as silence enveloped us. I braced myself for the explosion, my heart hammering in my chest, but just as her mouth opened, I caught sight of Ethan watching from a distance, his expression unreadable, a mix of shock and sorrow. Something in me broke at that moment. My conscience screamed at the pile of unnecessary blame heaped upon me. But then the mother hissed, "Don't think for one moment that this is over. You will regret this." The ominous chill in her tone cut right through my initial bravado, leaving an unsettling knot in my stomach. I left school that day haunted by my words, wrestling with fear that I'd crossed an unseen line, and as promised, the worst followed. First it was small things, a flat tire on the way home, bizarre coincidences that felt like the universe was suddenly aligning against me. But at prom, things escalated viciously. Jenna and her gang surrounded me, each pitiful story swinging like a pendulum, as they mercilessly dissected my past choices in the light of social media turmoil, revealing the ugly underbelly of high school politics. I felt like a pariah, watching them tear down everything I thought I'd done right, with every smug remark layered with laughter. Just as it seemed I'd reached the lowest point of despair, the lights dimmed in the hall and the music thumped, drowning out Jenna's taunts momentarily. It felt almost cinematic as I moved towards the punch bowl, desperate for solace. But then, behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of a throat being cleared. I turned around to see Ethan, his mother lurking behind him, her eyes glinting in the dark like a predator ready to pounce. You think this is over? She snarled again, and before I could respond, I bolted towards the exit, adrenaline surging through my veins, only to find myself cornered in a dimly lit supply room where she followed, her intentions written clearly across her face. I desperately scanned for an escape route, but she was too quick, locking the door behind her, trapping me in this nightmare. You think you can just turn him down and not expect consequences? You need to realize who you're dealing with, she said, her voice like ice. My heart raced. I tried to explain myself, but the words were lost amid the mounting terror. For a fleeting instant, Ethan appeared in the threshold, reaching for the handle, but his mother grasped my arm tightly, her grip unyielding, fixing me with a crazed expression, as if laced with a dark, hidden madness. You're going to pay for breaking his heart. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth about you, she hissed it like a curse, and in that instant, an overwhelming wave of helplessness gripped me, my nights of dread crashing into unbearable terror. My cell phone buzzed in my pocket, a true signal from the outside world, and with a jolt I reached in to find a series of frantic messages from friends, some concerning their own safety at home. But I had less time than I thought. Ethan finally managed to force the door open, and just as he did, his mother released her hold on me, and I stumbled backward into a wall. She turned to him, her face now a canvas of rage and grief, and with one swift, disarming gesture, she transformed from the predator to the victim, screeching about betrayal and ungrateful girls. I stepped back, panic and disbelief dancing between us as Ethan stood there, frozen, jaws clenched, his eyes darting from me to his mother, that one moment a lifetime of silence. I could see the flicker of realization overwhelm his features, as he turned away from her, and in that tense, split second, the promise of something both terrifying and liberating dawned within me. Ethan, it's okay, I blurted out. There's more to you than any of this. I would never forget the look on his face as he eventually stepped back, the weight of his past shattering under the reality of who he could be. As his mother shrieked one last time, the moment spiraled until it burst into 1,000 fragments, but one thing was clear, I was done being their scapegoat, their pawn in a game I didn't choose to play. The horror of their vindictive pull fluttered away as I stepped into the light, the weight of that night turning into fuel igniting my resolve to find my own way, uncaged from the illusion of what prom should have been. Some choices felt like chains, but I realized some were roads that led right back to dignity. All it took was the courage to walk away. A few weeks later, as high school faded into something only an afterthought, I discovered Ethan had unfollowed his mother on social media, cutting her negative influence clean from his life. And while I never heard from his mother again, the memory of that encounter lingered, a reminder of the darkness that once threatened to engulf me, a specter now banished under the light of a new beginning. I never thought refusing to babysit my niece would lead to such a haunting series of events, but here I am, fingers trembling over my keyboard, desperate to share what transpired. It all began with a simple family gathering, my heart warm from the laughter and the clinking of glasses, until my sister, Lily, confronted me. She didn't care for the way I brought my boyfriend, Jake, around. She said it was inappropriate, like a circus show crashing into a serene family picnic. I was blindsided, and feeling cornered, I snapped, telling her that I wouldn't stand for her judgmental attitude and her constant need to control who I bring into our family's space. She retaliated by demanding I babysit her kids that weekend, as if promising to take care of her children hinged on my compliance. I returned home in a rage, refusing to justify myself further. A cloud of tension hung over my mind, but I convinced myself it was just typical family drama and that things would blow over. However, that very night, I received a call from my brother-in-law, frantic and nearly incoherent. He said something had happened, that the kids weren't behaving, and Lily was off the deep end. Wordlessly, I felt the shadow of dread creep in. It turned out he was wrong. Lily had taken the kids to a local fair, and when she didn't come back, well, the phone calls began flooding in. Hours stretched into what felt like an eternity, my stomach knotting more tightly with each unanswered ring, until they found her car abandoned in the parking lot, the engine still warm, and the haunting echoes of laughter from the carnival turned into sirens and chaos. It was only after frantic searches that they found her 3 blocks away, screaming at the top of her lungs, but not for help. She was screaming at her kids, who stood there, petrified with wide eyes and trembling limbs. The problem? She claimed she had seen something dark and lurking, something that she insisted was trying to get them. It wasn't just a skit, it was real to her. The way she talked about it, like it was a relentless predator stalking the shadows, had everyone on edge. It landed her in a psychiatrist's office, the official diagnosis being acute stress reaction. She could no longer care for her kids without assistance, and that's when the guilt hit me like a freight train. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I should have just sucked it up and done my part while juggling my own feelings about Jake. Instead, I'd stood my ground like some stubborn rock while she spiraled into the unknown. It didn't help that the kids became more withdrawn. They wouldn't speak about the affair or even look me in the eye anymore. So, feeling responsible, I offered to step in on weekend babysitting duties to support her recovery, but the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with unfinished chords that resonated unanswered questions. I began to notice strange things happening during these sessions. The kids would stare at empty corners of the room, whispering things I couldn't hear. Their faces turned pale as if they saw memories of something wicked, and one evening, while I was trying to distract them with movies, I caught them doodling in their coloring books. One innocent scrawl read, "It saw us." I brushed it aside, chalking it up to vivid imaginations, but then I heard soft thumps coming from upstairs when nothing was up there. My heart raced. I pushed through the fear, convincing myself it was old house creaks. But when the children's laughter turned to sobs, and they refused to go near the window, I decided I needed to confront this terrifying new reality. There was a lingering chill each night, and as I'd watch the kids fall asleep, I'd scour every inch of the house trying to find traces of what had stolen their joy. Then one night, while flipping through channels with the twins snuggled under blankets, a local news report caught my attention, a witness account claiming in the area, and I swear to you, it was the exact description of what my sister had said she saw. Something with long fingers and a grotesque face that would make shadows tremble. Feeling sickened, I dismissed it as coincidence but couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. I called Lily, her voice muffled and terrified, begging me not to let the kids go outside alone, and suddenly, everything spiraled out of my control. I thought I was doing good by stepping in, but it only worsened. The kids' nightmares turned real, and they refused to stay in their rooms, screaming about the thing in the shadows whenever night fell. I tried to reassure them, but all they could talk about was how it knew where they were and how it wanted to take them. Every night, I'd hear the soft whispering and see shadows darting past the corners of my vision. I was sleepless, frantic, and terrified. Months went by and therapy didn't help Lily, and when I finally stole a moment to lay out everything that happened to my boyfriend, Jake, he listened, shaken but resolute, telling me we'd investigate the house. The moment we walked into that living room, I caught Jake watching the children out of the corner of his eye, murmuring, "It's just an illusion." I had hoped he was right. I couldn't bear the thought of the monstrous beliefs consuming my family. So one evening, armed with only a flashlight, we ventured through the attic, but all we found were old boxes and dusty memories until an unearthly silence hung in the air. I flipped the switch, and together, we felt the temperature drop. Hardly a breath could be heard, and suddenly those whispers kicked in more clearly. In sharp clarity, I felt it wash over me, an overwhelming sense of dread cementing my feet to the floor, and Jake jerked back, his face paling as he swept the beam across the shadows. And there it was, lurking in the edges, a twisted shape standing tall, fingers stretching impossibly long towards us. I wanted to scream. My instincts yelled to run, to grab the kids and flee, but in that moment, terror froze us in time. The thing whispered a name, my sister's name, and I realized then that it had wanted her all along, wanting to drag her into its world of darkness. That's when I heard my niece's voice, soft, innocent, and oh so familiar, calling me from downstairs, begging me to come play. I snapped awake from my horror, clutching my boyfriend's arm, and somehow rushed down the stairs, screaming for the kids to get away from the windows, but the room was empty. Silence smothered me alive, and when we managed to tear ourselves outside, a suffocating realization washed over me: the children were gone. Lily, lost in her own hell, and my family fracturing from the inside out, while the shadows grew ever longer. So now I sit here, sleepless, haunted, wrapped in both guilt and unanswered questions, because the thing that took my niece, that thing that chased echoes across our lives, had started as a mere judgment at a party, spiraling into a nightmare I never wanted to be a part of. Ida for refusing to babysit when I had no clue it would unravel into a much darker unfolding?